Welcome to Patients at Risk, a discussion of the dangers that patients face when physicians are replaced with non-physician practitioners. I'm your host and the co-author of the book Patients at Risk, The Rise of the Nurse Practitioner and Physician Assistant in Healthcare, Dr. Rebecca Bernard. One of the biggest challenges that physicians face today is negotiating a fair contract. It's also important that we make sure that our contract addresses the fair supervision of non-physician practitioners if that's going to be part of our job. Today, I am joined by attorney Dennis Hursh. He's an expert on physician contracts, and he's here to provide us advice on negotiating favorable and fair employment contract agreements. Mr. Hursh, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks. It's good to be here.
I read an article that you wrote for Kevin MD, and it was called Hospital Splaining, a Lawyer's Perspective on Condescension in the Medical Field. It just resonated with me so much. So I would love for you to tell our audience about your experience with helping physicians negotiate contracts, some of the challenges that you have faced working with hospitals and other large employers.
Sure. Well, in the article, I mentioned one example, but it happens all the time. Our firm, when we review a contract, we draft a letter on law firm stationery and say, we recommend changing these, this section and this section. And I was on the phone negotiating with a very nice lady from the hospital who gave us some things, but we got to the call section and she said, no, we can't change that. Now, I wasn't asking for the world. I really just had three things. I thought it should be equitably allocated, first of all, among all eligible providers, which, sometimes there are advantages to having nurse practitioners around. They can do call. I also wanted a reasonable limitation. Now, I think the person was joining a 5-person department. So I asked if we could limit call to 1 to 5. And we would have accepted more, honestly, but that seemed like a reasonable starting point. And I also said, there's benchmarks. MGMA, Medical Group Management Association, has benchmarks on excessive call. And we'd like to be paid if call is excessive. Well, the nice lady from the hospital just said, no, we can't possibly change that section because you see, Dennis, this is a business. And we need to have flexibility. And I'm not sure. I think what she expected me to do was, do a face plant. Said we never knew that. Oh, well, if it's a business, then, my silly physician should just do 24/7, 365 call. And I will just explain to her, that the hospital's a business. And I'm sure now that she understands how healthcare works, presumably she'll be fine with that. Well, that may have been what she expected, but obviously I said, well, I think we have a problem here. And we're not asking for the world, to be clear. We're not saying we don't want call. We're willing to take a fair share, but it has to be fair. And we went back and forth. We didn't end up with what I would call an ideal resolution, but they did agree that it would be equitably allocated. They refused to do a limit, but they did agree to payment for excessive call. So we got some things, but I think the reason that drove me to write the article was it was really condescending. I mean, it really was just explaining, you shouldn't need sleep because don't you understand I'm running a business, and at that point you should say, oh, well, then, it doesn't matter. And I find this all the time, and you can't blame them. I mean, if I'm a hospital administrator, I can't run the MRI 24/7. The MRI has to be down, for routine maintenance. I can't push my union workers because I'll have to pay them overtime. But, I can just keep hammering those physicians. They'll just keep coming back because they're going to care about their patients. They're not going to care about them. So, I can book them, tell them your workday is supposed to end at 5. I can have 6 patients in the waiting room at 5 o'clock, and they're not going to say, no, I'm going home. The physician's going to see them. And, I can give incredible charting, and then I just expect the physician to do that at home because why should a physician have a life? They should just do this charting. And literally the only portion of hospital operations that they can get away with is physicians. Nobody else will take that, but you can always just pile on physicians. And a physician will just work until she drops. And when she does, we'll just throw that extra work on the other physicians in the department and they'll do the same thing. There's just not a reason for me as a hospital administrator to say, hey, we should back off the physicians. They'll take whatever we give them, and they may complain, but they will always take care of their patients. So, it's getting worse all the time. It really is. It didn't used to be this bad. And I think hospital margins tighten. It looks like the CEO might not get his 7-figure bonus this year, and somebody's got to fix that. So guess who?
I appreciate that perspective so much because, we say it to ourselves as physicians, but it's so gratifying to hear someone that's not a doctor be able to identify and recognize that. I think we almost get this gaslight situation where we start to wonder, like, is it real, or are we just crazy? But I think what you've said is so true. It's this idea of the oath, and that you first and foremost are responsible to your patients. But as you've mentioned, hospital administrators, they've learned how to take advantage of that.
Yeah, they just say it's for your patients, Oh, aren't you looking out for your patients? So we're just asking another couple of hours, for your patients, but it isn't. And the pushback I usually give them is that at some point, quality of care is going to be affected. You cannot have somebody not sleeping, working, 19 hours a day in and day out, and you can't expect that person to give the quality of care that they would be capable of, if they had some rest and relaxation and could recharge once in a while. And I think that's usually the most successful argument that I have is like, obviously we can beat them up. Obviously, as a physician, they have no rights, but you really do have to worry about quality of care. And that's going to start being impacted if we push these people too hard. Physicians they're human. They don't like to admit it too much, and you don't act like you are a lot of times, but in fact, they're human and they'll break down if you don't, and they won't break down maybe spectacularly, but at some point the quality of care is going to dip. At some point you're going to be so tired, you're just not going to be as focused on that patient as you would have been, if you weren't just completely burned out.
I loved what you said in your article. You wrote, very few other professions are ever required to frequently give up sleep as an expected part of the job. Certainly no other profession is treated with such disdain by their employers. And that was really the crux of your article, is this condescension and this attitude. Why do you think that hospitals are so condescending to physicians, other than the fact that they can be? But what do you think is the reasoning behind it?
Well, honestly, I do think it's like I have bonuses that I can get for so much profitability. And like I said, I can't push that MRI too hard. I can't push the unionized workers, but there's one area that I can just drive into the ground, and that's the physicians. And I think some of them may honestly, and not every hospital administrator is a bad person. Not every hospital administrator thinks this way. But when you see CEOs getting 7-figure bonuses, you have to think that maybe the money was a little bit of a little bit of an incentive for them. And as I said, you can take it out of the physicians all the time, and that's the best place. And then I see things like they come in and say, well, we're going to give you a $5,000 raise. It's like, oh well, sure, I don't need to sleep then. For the big bucks. That'll wipe out my student loans.
It's so funny because I was reading that the average CEO of a nonprofit earns about $150,000, but the average CEO of a hospital nonprofit earns $500,000. So there's definitely a lot of money being made off of, in the C-suite. What else can doctors do, in your experience, to protect themselves against, adverse situations or poor employment contracts in the short term? And also, is there anything that you can think of that might help us in the long term as far as moving the needle a little bit on this trend?
Yeah, I think in the short term, I think before you take a position, there are places you can check out, like ryehe.org is run by a physician, and it rates your healthcare employer. and you can anonymously go in there. And I mean, you see things. I was looking the other day, and it's something, I think one of the head ones was "Don't even think about it," was the name of a hospital. I said, "Don't even think about it." And they're out there. I mean, I review contracts, and it's funny, there's two competing health systems not that far from me. And when one health system gives a contract, I usually don't hear from that physician again. When the other one does, usually in 3 years, they're contacting me. It's like, I got to get out of here. My contract's up. I can't stand it anymore. So there are places out there that rate that you can look at. It's tough, but at some point, I really do think, don't do it for yourself. Do it for your patients, and think about, they need a well-rested, enthusiastic physician. And what do we do to keep that? Is it going to kill you next year if you work 60-hour weeks like you always have? No, it won't kill you. But 5 years from now, are you going to be as good a physician as you are right now if you're doing that? And honestly, no, I don't think you will be. I think, you, not that you don't care just as much, but at some point you are going to burn out, and you aren't going to give the good care.
Have you noticed any differences between contracts from physician owned and non?
I do. I think generally physician owned understand what physicians do for a health system. And I think, everybody says we care about quality of care. I mean, you can't be a hospital exec and say, no, we just care about the bottom line. But the thing is, if I went to college and then got an MBA, and now I'm working in a business that happens to do healthcare, I'm going to have a little different perspective than somebody that went to medical school and has been treating patients on the front line and really knows what quality of care is. So yeah, I think physician-owned hospitals are definitely the way to go.
That's definitely something I would like to see addressed, to reverse that ban on physician-owned hospitals, especially since there's some data showing probably improved outcomes and lower costs.
Yeah.
So, have you had a lot of experience with helping physicians negotiate contracts when it comes to supervisory arrangements with non-physician practitioners?
Yeah, I see that a lot. And there's a couple of things you can do. I mean, I've had some that just did a hard line that said, I will not supervise mid-levels, because they didn't want, and maybe I won't say for my whole career I won't, but if I'm coming out of school, my first couple of years as an attending, I've had people say, I just don't want to supervise, let me get my feet on the ground and we can talk about it. More commonly, it's a question of trying to limit the amount, trying to limit your exposure. And honestly, you should be compensated for it. What infuriates me is I see hospitals come in that are paying physicians on productivity and saying, oh, by the way, we want you to supervise 3 mid-levels. I mean, it's crazy. It's, instead of doing WRVUs, I'm going to be looking over, the PA's chart and making sure that no mistakes were made. And at the end of the year, you're going to say, well, your productivity isn't that great. It's kind of below median. Yeah, I wonder why. Because again, I'm not producing WRVUs when I'm looking over charts and answering a quick question. And that's the problem. You don't know what you don't know. So a quick question, hey, what about, it may not be maybe a quick question, but not a quick answer, So you think, hey, just quickly in the hall. And it turns out to be, well, did you look at this? Did you look at that? Did you look at this? And so to me, that's the biggest thing, is if you're on productivity, you absolutely must be compensated for supervising mid-levels.
Do you usually recommend that your clients get a flat amount, or that they get a percent, or how do you recommend that be handled?
I prefer a flat amount. Usually it's between $8,000 to say $18,000 a year for each mid-level you supervise. People that are on pure productivity, I have seen a percentage of the mid-levels. So I've seen anywhere from 4 to 10%. So if the mid-level produces 100 WRVUs, the physician supervising them will get anywhere from 4 to 10 WRVUs for that supervision, which makes it, a little bit better. Again, I mean, it doesn't change the fact that you can't be 100% focused on your patients when you've got to come in and, answer a quick question or review charts for somebody that doesn't really know what they're doing. So it's certainly one of the big things I try to get is to make it real clear that you are not responsible for the care that mid-level is providing, and that the hospital will indemnify you for that, which isn't a big deal on their part. I mean, they've got malpractice insurance. It's mostly just to focus in their head that, hey, you can't put me in charge of this.
What about putting in some type of protection where if the physician is not comfortable with the quality of the care being provided, that there could be some kind of way that they can no longer supervise? Do you see anything like that?
Rarely, but I have seen it. Usually a hospital will be somewhat reasonable on that. If you come in and say, I'm not comfortable with the quality of care, usually a hospital will listen to that, and you can get some results. But I don't think it'd be a bad thing to put it into a contract.
Are you seeing physicians being replaced? Is that a trend that you've observed at all in your practice?
Not so much in my practice because I review employment agreements, but as a I hate to say geriatric, I don't feel old, but I am old. It used to be you'd go to the emergency room and it was physicians seeing you, and now more and more it's nurse practitioners, and maybe a physician will stick her head in at one point. And I mean, to me, it's just scary because nothing wrong with the nurse practitioner. I think they're wonderful people, and I'm sure they do a good job for what they do, but you don't know what you don't know. This ability that you have the ability to collaborate with a physician, that's fine. If you know that you need collaboration, but if you don't see an issue, obviously you're not going to collaborate. So yeah, I think it's pretty scary. The more they put patient care just completely on the shoulders of non-physicians.
And as you mentioned, most of the time it's just coming down to that bottom line and who's the least expensive person.
Yeah.
But we're definitely pushing back against this and trying to make sure that patient safety is paramount. And one of the ways we're doing that is trying to keep our doctors employed and happy. And I think that's where you really come in and help us out a lot. So talk to us about your book.
Oh, it's The Final Hurdle, A Physician's Guide to Negotiating a Fair Employment Agreement. And I wrote it because I realized that there really wasn't a resource out there. It's not like, I think I can honestly say it's the best book out there on it because it's the only book out there on it. But there really wasn't a resource. And, some people like to do it themselves, or at least want an overview of what should I be looking for. And that was the purpose of the book, to kind of give you an overview and say, here's the issues you should be concerned with. Here's a possible workaround. And it's sold several thousand copies. So I guess it's helping. I don't know.
That's fantastic. Can you give us a few pearls from the book? Of course, we'll encourage all of our listeners to get a copy for themselves.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a few things. One is I see all the time, don't just agree in a dinner. I see all the time they take you out to a dinner and they say, now we all signed a covenant not to compete, so you're okay with that, right? And without looking at it, you say, oh, well, sure, if everybody else signed it, yeah, I'll do that. And then you get into the contract and it's, you won't practice medicine within 3 states or something, and you go back and say, wait a minute, this is unreasonable. And they say, oh no, you said that. So I think part of it is being a little cagey when you're talking to people, like not, oh yes, I agree to that. And even on a salary, unless you have MGMA data at your fingertips to say, well, we're thinking of paying this much, does that sound good? Well, especially if you're in training, yeah, it sounds really good. But you have no idea if that's fair. So, a lot of times say, well, yeah, it sounds like the ballpark, but I think, we'll have to see what the contract says. And I'll try and look for some benchmarks just to satisfy myself. And most people understand that. So it really is, don't agree to a whole lot before you get the contract. I've had that too many times. I've had people, I'm negotiating, I'll say the salary's a little low, and the first thing they say is, oh, the physicians agreed to that. And sometimes they've agreed to it in a letter of intent that says it's non-binding. I think that's one of the scariest things for me. Physicians see something that says this is non-binding, and they say, it's just a detail, and they sign it. And it is non-binding, but the employer is going to say you've agreed to that. Whether you legally agreed, as far as the employer is concerned, that's off the table. So they're not going to like to hear, oh, my attorney looked at the MGMA and I see that's 20,000 below median. They're going to say, oh no, you signed a letter of intent. We've agreed on the salary. So I think letters of intent are something that you really have to be a little more focused on.
So don't sign anything until you're sure. And ideally, you've consulted with someone, probably somebody like you, an attorney that can advise. My first employment contract, I didn't even negotiate my salary. Like you said, I had just graduated residency and it looked like a lot of money. And I remember saying, thank you.
Yeah. Like they were doing you a favor. Right?
The employer like almost immediately said, oh, we can go up about 20,000 on that. Like he actually, and I thought to myself, oh, later on, I said, I probably could have got 50,000 more. Yeah, so he was throwing 20 at me right away. But no, nobody told me. And actually, I did have a lawyer that looked over it, but I don't think that I think they just assumed I would negotiate that. And they were talking to me about the no compete and other things. But everything's negotiable. And would you say that it's pretty common that that first salary is something that they offer you is you can always go up from that generally?
Well, generally is the key word. Yeah, most people don't come in and say, this is my final offer. Here's the money. I mean, most people have some wiggle room. Even academic institutions have ranges, and they're very rarely going to come in and offer you the top of the range. I mean, they'll say, no, we have a fixed salary for that position, and they do, but it's not, to the penny. It's somewhere within a range. So yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. And I think the biggest thing to think about, and it's particularly true when you're coming out of training, but I think it's for other people as well, is you have to realize that when they've made the job offer, they want you. You didn't get to where you are without being super competitive. You had to be very competitive in college. You had to be very competitive in med school, trying to be the chief resident, always competing. And I think you take that competition in and you're thinking, oh, I want to make sure I get this. Once they've made a job offer, you are the prize. Now you're not competing anymore. They want you. So you have to bear that in mind. And I think so many physicians, like I said, you didn't get to where you are without being competitive. But you got to realize, the race is over. Once they give you that offer, they want you. I'm not saying you can say, I want triple the salary and, 8 months vacation or something, and it won't go to the next person, but they want you, and they've invested a lot of time to pick you, a lot of physician time. They weren't seeing patients and billing for the employer. They were talking to you. So they're pretty invested in this. A recruiter can be like 3 months of salary if they're paying a recruiter. So they've got a huge amount invested and they want you, and I think a lot of physicians don't realize that. It's like, oh, I got to get right back to them. I got to do this. I don't want to look greedy. I don't want to look, and you're not. As I said, you're the prize now. You're not competing anymore once that offer is made.
And really, it's just about the only time that you do have that advantage, because it seems like once you sign on the dotted line, then the hospital splaining gets way worse in my experience. Usually they're really nice to you before you sign.
Yeah, if they are really hardcore in negotiations, you really have to think about that. Because as you said, that's the nicest they're ever going to be to you. Once you've signed, it's going to be like, read your contract, doctor. That's it.
When it comes to negotiating for women physicians, we know there's still a gender pay gap. And I tend to have this philosophy that I tell women, if you're going to get a salary that they offer you, maybe just assume that that's 30% less than what a man might get. Am I crazy on that? Or do you think that's good advice?
If I hadn't seen a study that was done in Maryland, I don't know if you saw that, but it was for something like 2021. And female physicians made something like 30% less than males. This is not 1921, 2021. And the study people said it was adjusted for full-time. People come back and say, oh, well, some women are part-time, and that explains it. It was adjusted for that. And taking that into account, there was that big a gap. So, no, I think I think it's particularly important for women to look at the benchmarks, and you have to know why. And if somebody's offering you less than median, there better be an explanation. I mean, what I've told people is, like, if you don't think this position is median quality, why are you hiring her? You know, I mean,
Now, is
if
that are those medians that you have to buy that from somewhere?
yeah, it's MGMA
Okay.
has it.
And is it broken down by location and things like that to really help you?
Yeah, it really is a location and employer. Now it depends on some subspecialties. You almost have to look at national, but a lot of specialties and even some subspecialties. I was just looking at a sports medicine orthopedic surgeon in Pennsylvania employed by a hospital, and there was a database for that. So kind of a subspecialty in Pennsylvania employed by a hospital. That's a database. It doesn't compare to private practice, doesn't compare to New York. So yeah, and it's very hard. If you're getting paid less than that, there really has to be an explanation as to why.
Got it. Other than negotiating salary and vacation, which we all think about, is there anything else that doctors should think about negotiating into their contract?
Well, tail coverage I find is huge. And sometimes the language is really kind of nebulous. You read it and it says, we will cover you for all claims that occur while you are employed. And are they saying it's occurrence based? That kind of sounds like occurrence based, but try to really nail them down. And I usually try to get, a lot of hospitals will pay for tail, but the ones that don't, I think there are instances in which they should, and I don't care if it's private practice or what. Like if you die, I think your tail should be paid. If you become disabled, I think your tail should be paid. If they terminate you without cause, I think they should pay your tail. So there's a lot of reasons you can say, look, just in general fairness, I think these are instances in which you should pay the tail. But it's funny for me because the same people that'll explain to you that it's a business don't view that as a cost of doing business. That's somehow your problem. Yeah, getting insurance after you leave, that's your problem. And we're going to put that on you. And I just don't think that's fair.
Yeah, and tail is pretty expensive. What is it, like 2.5 times an annual malpractice premiums?
Yeah, generally. And yeah, it can be a lot of money.
Definitely. Do you ever see doctors negotiate things like a shorter schedule, like maybe having a time off during the week to get things done? I think that's a big cause of burnout for a lot of doctors. Like, when are you supposed to go to the doctor and the dentist and the bank and things like that?
Yeah, I do. And I think even as a full-time physician, the thing that you want to have nailed down is patient contact hours. I mean, I've seen contracts that it was pretty clear that you're going to be seeing patients 40 hours a week. Well, if you're seeing patients 40 hours a week, I don't have to tell you, we're talking 60 maybe hours a week of work, maybe 70, maybe more. And that's not counting call. I mean, that just means doing your administrative stuff and calling the pharmacy and all that stuff, arguing about and calling the insurance company. So I usually try to get 32 patient contact hours a week for a full-time physician. And again, that is still very much a full-time physician. You're going to be working more than 40 hours a week, forgetting call if you are just seeing patients 32.
Have you been pretty successful with that? Do most hospitals seem to go along with it?
It's getting better. 36 I get pretty commonly. Sometimes I get 32, sometimes I don't, but you can get 36 patient contact hours a week, which is better than nothing.
Well, is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners?
No, I think the biggest thing is to know your worth. And when you're talking to somebody that's in a hospital chair, always remember, and I tell people, I could have been a physician too. There's just really two things that kept me. One is I'm not smart enough, and two is I didn't want to work that hard. But other than that, I could do what you do, and that's kind of what they're thinking sitting in the chair. I could do what you do. And you just never forget who's the smartest person in the room when you're talking. I may have the big seat and the big view behind me and all that, but just never forget. And I usually ask to be addressed as doctor. And extra, in fairness, the way my mother raised me, then she would call me Mr. Hursh, but extra points if you can say Dr. Bernard. Well, thank you, Dennis. Just kind of to get, but it kind of does. I mean, that's the first thing. And you think they're being friendly. Hey, can I call you Rebecca? And it sounds, oh, that sounds nice. But right away now, you and I are, kind of peers now. If we're both first name, I think it just has a different impact than just saying, oh, no, I'd prefer Dr. Bernard. If that's okay, I'd prefer Dr. Bernard. I just think it helps just the mindset a little bit in the room. We're not two peers. We're not two folks that are both the same. It's like, no.
I love that. Like, thank you for saying that, especially for women doctors. That's, there's studies on that too, where you're sitting on a panel and they go, this is Dr. Smith, Dr. Jones, and Dr. Rebecca, that happens a lot.
Yeah.
And not that you want to make a big deal out of it, but your point that, that name is either a leveling or it's a distinguishing quality. So that's so interesting.
Yeah. No, I think it's important too. And again, I'm not asking, you earned it. It's, I'm not saying, hey, you should put me up because I'm a wonderful person. Just that's an honorific that you've earned.
Where are you located?
I'm in Middletown, Pennsylvania. It's near Harrisburg. I actually review contracts in all 50 states, though.
Fantastic. Well, we're definitely going to include your information, your book, and also how to contact you if any of our physicians would like to get some help with their employment contract. It sounds like you've been doing this a long time and you're a huge physician advocate, which I so appreciate. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the topic of non-physicians in healthcare, please get my books, Patients at Risk and Imposter Doctors. Both are available at Amazon. And if you're a physician and you'd like to learn more about getting involved in our mission, which is advocating for physician-led care for all patients and truth and transparency among healthcare practitioners, please join our group. It's called Physicians for Patient Protection. Our website is physiciansforpatientprotection.org. And if you like this podcast and you have an idea for a topic or you'd like to appear on the podcast, please send me an email. You can reach me through my website, patientsatrisk.com. Thanks so much, and we'll see you on the next podcast.